All right, this video is on poet Sylvia Plath and her poem Lady Lazarus. So her biography is really significant. So we're going to spend some time here. Her dates are 1932 to 1963. So you can see, tragically, she died very young, had a very short life. And that is part of what makes her such an iconic figure in American literature, is just the brevity of her life and how intense it was. So she was born in Boston to kind of, an upper middle class family. Her father died when she was a child, and the story goes that he was a very authoritative figure in their home. So she definitely had some like issues with her father, and he died because he was a diabetic. And as often happens to people with diabetes, he got a wound in his foot. But because he was such a stubborn, proud person, he refused to have it treated properly. And eventually it turned to gangrene. And it got to the point where the doctors were actually recommended that he have his foot amputated. But again, because of his just pride and stubbornness, he refused. And if you don't treat gangrene, then it kills you. And so that's what he died of. And so again, you can imagine that kind of personality would have an effect on a young girl for sure. And she even has poetry about her father, and just kind of the issues there. She did study abroad. She was well educated, went to college in New England, and when she was studying in Europe, that was where she met and married a British poet named Ted Hughes. And they had two children together, but it just really didn't go well. Just a few years into their marriage, there were already all kinds of issues, and in fact, they were in process of divorce or maybe already divorced. I'm honestly not sure of the detail. When she took her own life. So I have another slide of biography here. She is known as what's called a confessional poet, and this was a new idea in American literature. And what the confessional poets, what made them distinctive is that their poems were very personal. So I'll draw the contrast here. So whereas Gwendolyn Brooks wrote the poem The Mother about a woman who has had abortions, Sylvia Plath wrote Lady Lazarus about herself and her own suicide attempt. So her poetry is essentially kind of exposing her own heart and soul in a very explicit and direct way that hadn't been done. It just really hadn't been done in the past, so it was a new idea. She also wrote a novel called The Bell Jar, that is very famous, and she's not as good a novelist as she is a poet, just as far as her writing style, but it is still a fascinating book. And the reason it's called The Bell Jar is that back then, treatment for a lot of psychological issues or hysteria, insanity, whatever they wanted to call it, was electric shock treatment. So Sylvia Plath tells the story of how, as a young woman, because of her depression, suicide attempts, she was treated in this way, and the device that they used to administer this electric shock was a bell jar. And so it really kind of lets you in on her mental struggles, her struggles with mental illness. And like I said, it's not like she doesn't have the same talent for narrative as she does for poetry, but especially if you're interested in like psychology, I really recommend this book. It's fascinating. She did suffer from depression and mental illness really her whole life, and it is amazing. She's such a talented poet. If she had lived longer, what else she could have written. But as they say, to be a really famous author, it does feel like you have to have had some really difficult things happen in your life. And she did eventually take her own life by suicide after multiple attempts. And it's quite an iconic, famous story in that she took her own life by turning on the gas stove, and they found her with her head in the oven. And so let me just be clear here. She died by suffocation of, inhaling the gas. It wasn't like the oven was on in the sense that she burned herself. But it was just very sad. Her children were in the house. And she even went to such lengths as to like shut herself in the kitchen and put towels under the doors and stuff. So like I said, a very, very sad legacy. And there's a lot of controversy around it. And that's what I actually have you writing your bonus blog post on. So you'll just have to look at the details on that. But go ahead and open your books, if you haven't already, to Lady Lazarus. This is on page 622. And this is a little bit of a lengthy poem. And I'm actually going to have you guys listen to a recording of Sylvia Plath reading the poem herself. So this recording I found on YouTube. Some of the images are a little disturbing. I'll just give you that warning. I mean, it's not terrible. But it's more for the, I want you guys to hear the audio. So we're going to take time to listen to the whole thing. I think it's important, and it is just really interesting to hear a poet read her own work. So here we go.
Lady Lazarus. I have done it again. 1 year in every 10 I manage it, a sort of walking miracle. My skin bright as a Nazi lampshade, my right foot a paperweight, my face a featureless, fine Jew linen. Peel off the napkin, O my enemy. Do I terrify? Yes, yes, Herr Professor, it is I. Can you deny the nose, the eye pits, the full set of teeth? The sour breath will vanish in a day. Soon, soon the flesh the grave cave ate will be at home on me, and I a smiling woman. I am only 30, and like the cat, I have 9 times to die. This is number 3. What a trash to annihilate each decade. What a million filaments. The peanut-crunching crowd shoves in to see them unwrap me hand and foot, the big strip tease. Gentlemen, ladies, these are my hands, my knees. I may be skin and bone. I may be Japanese. Nevertheless, I am the same identical woman. The first time it happened, I was 10. It was an accident. The second time I meant to last it out and not come back at all. I rocked shut as a seashell. They had to call and pick the worms off me like sticky pearls. Dying is an art, like everything else. I do it exceptionally well. I do it so it feels like hell. I do it so it feels real. I guess you could say I've a call. It's easy enough to do it in a cell. It's easy enough to do it and stay put. It's the theatrical comeback in broad day to the same place, the same face, the same brute, amused shout, a miracle that knocks me out. There is a charge for the eyeing of my scars. There is a charge for the hearing of my heart. It really goes. And there is a charge, a very large charge, for a word or a touch or a bit of blood or a piece of my hair or my clothes. So, Herr Doctor. So, Herr Enemy. I am your opus. I am your valuable. The pure gold baby that melts to a shriek. I turn and burn. Do not think I underestimate your great concern. Ash, ash, you poke and stir, flesh, bone. There is nothing there, a cake of soap, a wedding ring, a gold filling. Hear God, hear Lucifer, beware, beware. Out of the ash I rise with my red hair, and I eat men like air.
Okay, so that's disturbing, right? And I think the most interesting thing about that recording is if you had to guess her age, how old would you say the woman reading that poem is? She sounds quite old to me, but in reality, Sylvia Plath, when she read that poem, was, in her late 20s. And so, like younger than me. And it's just amazing how kind of old and disturbed she sounds reading that poem. Okay, so first of all, I want to talk about the title, Lady Lazarus. I hope you guys understand the biblical allusion there. Lazarus was raised from the dead by Jesus, and this poem is about a failed suicide attempt where Plath feels like, again, she was raised from the dead. She was so close to her goal of ending her life, and yet the doctors were able to bring her back. And just to give you some further context, so this suicide attempt that she's referring to here um, is one that, again, I feel like everything about Sylvia Plath is very famous. So apparently she overdosed and then crawled under her front porch, like the crawl space under the front porch, and was there for 3 days before they found her. Again, the reference to Lazarus. But they did eventually find her and got her out and got her well again. So that's what this whole poem is about. So let's start by talking about tone. Um, if you had a couple words to describe her tone, there's definitely a sense of sarcasm almost, or a very cynical, dark view on life. She has this kind of dark humor about the situation and just very biting and edgy and raw. There's not really a tone of regret, or even if you talk to people who have gone through a suicide attempt and survived, there's often a spirit of gratitude, thankfulness that another chance. And we don't hear any of that from Plath. Her word choice is very, very edgy and direct. So let's talk about why it is that way specifically. I think one of the main things I want to pull out here is the irony of her attitudes towards life and death. So um, when she talks about dying, it's in a very, again, kind of light, sarcastic tone. So I'm on page 623. Look at line 20, right round about there. She says, I'm a smiling woman, I am only 30, and like the cat, I have 9 times to die. So just making light of her suicide attempts. This is number 3, what a trash to annihilate each decade. What a million filaments. The peanut crunching crowd shoves in to see them unwrap me hand and foot. The big strip tease, gentlemen, ladies. So she's comparing her being brought back to life to a striptease, and that is something that is raunchy and cheap, right? And what's really interesting about this whole poem, and even just Sylvia Plath as a person, she did not like the attention on her personal life. And you can see she calls them the peanut crunching crowd. They don't care about me. They just want a glimpse of crazy Sylvia Plath, right? The million filaments are, she's referring to like light bulbs and photographers. She's like, oh, fine, ladies and gentlemen, come on over and see the freak show. So she doesn't want that negative attention. However, she's writing a poem about it and publishing it for the world to see. Do you guys see the irony of that? So even that in and of itself is really interesting. If you skip down to line 40, 45, she says, dying is an art, like everything else. I do it exceptionally well. I do it so it feels like hell. I do it so it feels real. I guess you could say I've a call. So this idea, she kind of glamorizes suicide, and she says it's her calling and it's something that she does really well. And so again, her attitude towards death is almost one of glamour, and it's very interesting, and it's an art form to her. Whereas when she talks about coming back to life, if you turn the page to page 624, she says it's the comeback in broad day. To the same place, the same face, the same brute amused shout, a miracle that knocks me out. So she doesn't like the coming back to life. And she even, when she talks to the doctors, she addresses the doctors who were able to resuscitate and bring her back to life. And she says, Herr Doctor, Herr Enemy, I'm your opus. I am your valuable, the pure gold baby. So basically, she's saying, like, you don't care about me as a person. I'm just like a prize that you were able to bring me back to life, some kind of trophy. So her attitude towards life and those who brought her back to life is very negative. And so again, there's a lot of irony going on here that contributes just her overall dark tone about this whole situation. And then the other thing we need to address is the purpose of all these Holocaust allusions. And so I hope you guys read the footnotes to catch those. There are quite a few allusions to the Holocaust, and a couple of things to point out here. So, World War II was over mid 40s. It really took some time for all the details of the Holocaust to come to light. So, this is very fresh here in the early 60s. This is, these details about, Jews being, burned or, being put to death in gas chambers, and then their bodies being burned in furnaces. And then they would go through to try and find, a gold filling, or they would use the ashes to make soap, and, all these just terrible atrocities. So this was all very fresh and new. What's weird and fascinating is that Plath aligns herself with the Jewish people. She's basically comparing her suffering to that of those who endured the Holocaust, which in some ways is very, very offensive, right? Yes, depression is real. Yes, mental illness is difficult. But to put herself in that kind of position is in a lot of ways offensive to those who did survive or perished in the Holocaust. What I think it draws attention to you is just how she sees the absolute drama and darkness of her situation, of her depression, of her hopelessness. She views her life in a very hopeless way. And so she pulls in those Holocaust allusions. And there are quite a few throughout. And that is it's kind of a controversial element of her poetry, is exactly what those mean and why she included them. And there are a lot of different ways you could look at it. I think for the most part, again, she wants to bring attention to just the stark hopelessness that she is experiencing mentally in her life. So that is Sylvia Plath and Lady Lazarus. Like I said, this is pretty dark stuff. It's pretty intense. But this is typical of postmodern poetry, especially taking a difficult topic like suicide and just addressing it in just the most open, raw, gritty way possible. And just, embracing the tension in ways that authors have not really done before. And so there's some good things that came out of it. Sadly, a lot of the worldview that we see reflected in this poetry is very dark. So we can just be thankful for the hope that we have. So I hope this video was helpful, and let me know if you have any questions.